I just want to say the desert's awesome. After spending the majority of my life living in Canada, surrounded by forests and mountains, I thought that the idea of going on a road trip through the Southwest in the middle of the desert would be kind of boring. But boy, was I wrong. The Southwest is filled with deserts, rocks, well, actually a lot of rocks, and so much more. Over the week of American Thanksgiving, me and 4 of my other friends took a road trip across the American Southwest. And in this video, I'm going to break down the cost, the itinerary, and what I would do differently next time. Our 8-day trip starts in Los Angeles. Since there's 5 of us, we realistically couldn't drive around in your normal Honda Civic or your Toyota Corolla, so we had to rent out a bigger car from Enterprise. So with our new whip, we assembled the dream team and started our 8-day trek into the desert. On day 1, we made the drive from LA to Las Vegas while stopping in Death Valley for a break. Aside from stopping for a quick bite and catching the sunset, we really didn't do much in this park. If you're gonna do this trip, you have to cop the Discover America Pass. It's an $80 annual pass that gets you entry into all the national parks in America. And you only need to visit 3 parks in order to make the pass worth it. After Death Valley, we headed into Vegas. And after grabbing some food, we headed down to Fremont Street to explore and hit up some clubs and bars. Day 2 was making a drive from Vegas to Zion while first making a stop in the Valley of Fire. Now, if you're going to do this trip, you have to hit up the Valley of Fire. Catching the sunset with the red rocks is probably one of my favorite views of the whole entire trip. After the Valley of Fire, we drove into Springdale, which is just outside of Zion National Park. Day 3 was hiking Zion, and honestly, it's probably my favorite day of the whole entire trip. Zion is super beautiful, and there's a mix of everything nature-wise. From waterfalls, to mountains, to rivers, there's something for everyone, and there's hikes from varying levels of difficulty. While in Zion, we did 2 hikes, Angel's Landing and Emerald Pools. Now, if I could do this trip over again, I would definitely spend another day in Zion because I feel like we missed out on not doing the Narrows. After our hikes, we had some pizza and caught the sunset before driving the hour and a half to our next destination, Bryce Canyon. On day 4, we were all a little bit tired, so we did a shorter hike in Bryce Canyon. We ended up doing the Queen's Garden and Navajo Loop hike. This hike is super nice and it showcases a lot of the hoodoos, which is just another word for cool rocks. Bryce was significantly colder than Zion, so I definitely recommend dressing in layers. And if I were to do this trip again, I would definitely try to catch sunset and then do some stargazing in Bryce because it looks pretty sick. So after a short hike in Bryce, we said goodbye to Utah and made the drive towards Page, Arizona. But we made a quick stop in Kanab to see the Coral Pink Sand Dunes State Park, which is also a really nice place to catch the sunset. On day 5, we spent the day in and around Page. We got to see Horseshoe Bend, which is a really short drive from Page. You have to pay $10 to park your car, but honestly, it's not that bad and the views are definitely worth it. One really popular spot that a lot of people go to is Lower and Upper Antelope Canyon. If you want to see these views, you have to book a tour because it's on Navajo land, which is something that we didn't know before going on this trip, which means we had to unfortunately skip this part, which is a big L, honestly. I'm super sad about it. Instead, we backtrack a bit and hit up Wire Pass Trail. This hike requires you to drive through a pretty bumpy off-road to get to the trailhead. And from the trailhead, it's probably like a 10-20 minute walk before you hit those super cool narrows. Now, if I were to do Page again, I would make sure to definitely book Antelope Canyon in advance because I really regret not seeing it. And I would try to book it around noon so you can get that sunlight peeking through the top like you see in all those pictures. After our mini hike, we made the 3-hour drive to our next sleeping spot, Flagstaff. The hotel that we stayed at in Flagstaff was honestly my favorite of the whole entire trip. If you're ever on Flagstaff on a Wednesday, make sure to hit up Museum Club. It's a super fun time, and on Wednesdays, they have $2 pictures. On day 6, we drove out to see the Grand Canyon, which is about an hour and a half from Flagstaff. Let me be completely honest here. Y'all can get mad at me in the comments, but the Grand Canyon is mid. I'm really not sure why it's hyped up so much, but after being there, I don't think it can really compare to the other views that you can see on this trip. To be fair, it was really cold and we didn't actually do a hike and only ended up walking on the rim, so I'm sure if I actually did a hike and went down to the canyon, I would have enjoyed it more, but for now, it's staying as mid-tier. After our little walk at the Grand Canyon, we drove back to Flagstaff and explored the city before grabbing dinner and going to bed. Before the Grand Canyon, we were always super pressed on time, so it was nice to have a pretty chill day. On day 7, we said goodbye to our 4 beds and started making the drive to Phoenix after stopping in Sedona. While in Sedona, we saw the Church of the Holy Cross, which is basically just this church that's built on this hill, but it's honestly really cool. The architecture is sick and it's definitely worth checking out if you're in the area. So, after making our little stopover in Sedona, we made our way to our final city, Phoenix. Since we didn't do any hikes in Sedona, we got to explore downtown Phoenix for a bit, which is pretty cool. Unfortunately for us, it was the Friday of Thanksgiving weekend and all the bars and all the clubs were pretty much dead. On day 8, the plan was to drive from Phoenix to LA while making a stop in Joshua Tree as a break. So we left pretty early and the drive was going fine until we got into California. Then we were hit with some super bad traffic. It was start and stop for maybe like 2 hours. Who would have thought that everyone else is also going back to LA at the end of Thanksgiving? In total, we drove around 1,800 miles, which is around 2,900 kilometers, for a total of almost 35 hours of driving. Now, you're probably wondering, how much did this trip cost? In total, the cost of the rent-a-car and the gas was around $330. We were really lucky and were able to get a very good corporate discount, which brought the cost of the car down by a lot. Honestly, without the corporate discount, I don't know if a trip like this would have been possible, especially since we're young drivers and we'd be hit with a super big fee. Now, if you have your own car, this trip could be significantly cheaper because you don't have to rent one, but you'd be putting mileage on your own car, so there's a trade-off. Another tip that I have is to book the rental car on an Amex or another travel credit card so that A, you can get the points, and B, you don't have to pay for renter's insurance like we did. Next, accommodations. The total amount that we spent on hotels was around $193, which ended up being $27 a night per person, which is insanely good. $27 a day makes sense because we're sharing 5 people to one room and one guy's got to sleep on the floor in an air mattress. On average, the hotels were $150 a night and they were all pretty good. There was none that was specifically bad, except for maybe Vegas. Next up, we have admission costs. This includes all the fees to get into state parks, national parks, and even bars and clubs. This ended up being around $55 a person, which I think is pretty good. Now, the food ended up being one of the most expensive parts of this whole entire trip. In total, we spent around $230 on food per person, which ends up being around $32 a day. Now, this cost can drastically change from person to person, especially if you're willing to cook your meals on the road. But for us to organize meals like that for 5 different people who had 5 different diets, it was not really worth the time or the hassle. And especially since we're on a time crunch, we decided to just bite the bullet and eat out most of the time. You could also only eat at McDonald's or other fast food places, but you're going to feel sick, especially after doing all those hikes. So I think the cost of the food is just one of those things that have to go along with this kind of road trip. In total, this trip cost everyone around $815, not including the flights or the souvenirs. The reason that I'm not including the flight is because everyone flew from different places, and you're probably going to fly from a different place if you're going to run this trip as well. Now, this road trip was super great and I had a lot of fun, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't do things differently if I were to do it again. First and foremost, I wish we had more time to do this trip. Don't get me wrong, the views are sick, but the days in November are super short, and only having 7 days means we definitely had to skip out on some parts that I wanted to see. In terms of time of the year, I think November is a great time to actually do this trip. It's a shoulder season, which means you get less people and you're not dying from the heat during your hikes. It does get cold and the days are shorter, but if you plan accordingly, I think it could be a great time to run this trip. Overall though, this trip is super fun and one that I really recommend doing. This is my second time doing an adult trip where I track all of the expenses, so it's super interesting to see how the money goes this time around. But if you're wondering about that first trip and how much I spent, you can watch this video right here where I go over how much I spent in Banff.